I spent 9 long years feeling utterly disowned and misunderstood by my family. 9 years of carrying the weight of their judgment on my shoulders every single day. In our modest home on the outskirts of Boston, I was the black sheep, the one they called ugly and poor, when they thought I couldn't hear them through the thin walls of our New England colonial house. My Aunt Margaret was the worst. During Sunday dinners at my grandmother's place in Cambridge, she'd look at me with thinly veiled disgust, turning to my mother to whisper comments about my second-hand clothes or my unruly hair. My cousins, Emma and Tyler, had learned from their parents, snickering behind their hands when I entered a room. Even my own father, Thomas, a banking executive who had made something of himself, could barely hide his disappointment when introducing me to his colleagues at the rare company picnics I was allowed to attend. "This is my youngest," he'd say, never meeting my eyes, never using my name. The silence that followed always felt deafening. School offered no refuge. At Oak Ridge High, the social hierarchy was clearly defined, and I existed somewhere near the bottom. My worn-out backpack and discount store clothes marked me as different in a school where most kids arrived in luxury cars and wore designer labels. Lunch periods were the hardest. I'd sit alone at the far end of the cafeteria, watching groups of friends laughing together, planning weekend trips to the mall or parties I'd never be invited to. There was one teacher, Mrs. Collins, who seemed to see beyond my awkward exterior. She taught English literature, and in her classroom, I found temporary escape in the worlds of Dickens and Austen. "You have a keen mind," she told me once, after I'd turned in an essay on Pride and Prejudice. That small acknowledgement felt like water in a desert. At home, I'd lock myself in the small bedroom I shared with boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax returns. The space was barely mine, just like my existence seemed barely acknowledged. My sister, Rachel, 5 years older and infinitely more favored, had her own room with a bay window and matching furniture. My corner had a twin bed with a metal frame and a wobbly desk I'd rescued from a neighbor's curb. When I was 16, I overheard a conversation that solidified my outsider status. It was Thanksgiving and relatives had gathered at our house. I was coming back from the bathroom when I heard my name mentioned in the dining room. "What are you going to do about her?" my grandmother asked. "What can we do?" my mother responded with a sigh. "She's just different. Not like Rachel." "It's embarrassing," my aunt chimed in. "Did you see the way she dresses?" And that face, poor thing, didn't get any of the family's good genes. I froze in the hallway, heart pounding as my father's voice joined the chorus. "She doesn't try. Rachel was always motivated, social. This one just exists." That night, I stood before the bathroom mirror, examining the features they found so disappointing. My uneven nose, slightly crooked teeth, the acne scars on my cheeks. I wasn't ugly, just ordinary, in a family that valued extraordinary. The isolation shaped me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I became observant, watching how people interacted, noting the social currency of beauty and wealth. I listened to conversations about investments and business opportunities that flowed freely at family gatherings. I absorbed knowledge about how the world worked while being assumed too dull to understand. My bedroom became my sanctuary and workshop. I'd cut out magazine articles about successful entrepreneurs, study fashion trends I couldn't afford to follow, and make notes about how people with influence carried themselves. At night, I'd whisper promises to myself that someday, things would be different. In my senior year of high school, I got a job at a local coffee shop. The manager, Dave, was the first person who treated me like I was capable. He started me at the register, but quickly taught me about inventory, scheduling, and handling difficult customers. For the first time, I felt competent, even valuable. I saved every penny, hidden in a lockbox under my bed. The growing sum represented more than money. It was freedom, potential, and the foundation of my escape plan. I applied to state colleges, focusing on business programs, determined to understand the world that had excluded me. The day my acceptance letter came from Northeastern, no one at home noticed my excitement. At dinner, I mentioned it casually, hoping for some acknowledgement. "College," my father scoffed. "Where do you think that money's coming from?" "I've saved," I said quietly. And there are scholarships, loans. My mother looked concerned, not for my future, but for the potential burden. Maybe you should just work for a while, save more. Rachel, home for the weekend from her life in New York, where she worked for a fashion magazine, smiled condescendingly. College isn't for everyone, you know. That night, as tears soaked my pillow, something hardened inside me. Their doubt wasn't going to be my reality. The constant judgment and neglect had formed a deep part of my identity, but beneath the hurt was growing determination. I would transform myself not for their approval, but to prove that the value of a person, my value, couldn't be measured by appearance or family status. The quiet whisper of ambition grew louder, drowning out their voices. Every insult became fuel, every dismissal a challenge. I would rebuild myself from the ground up, creating an identity so far removed from their perception that they wouldn't recognize me when I was done. And one day, I promised myself they would regret every unkind word, every opportunity for love they had squandered. The September I started at Northeastern University marked the beginning of my metamorphosis. Moving into the cramped dorm room felt like stepping into freedom despite the cinder block walls and squeaky bed. My roommate Zoe, a bubbly communications major from Chicago, took one look at my 3 cardboard boxes of possessions and offered to share her microwave and mini fridge. It was the first act of genuine kindness I'd experienced from a peer, and I nearly cried on the spot. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my reaction. "Yeah, I managed. Just tired from the drive." I didn't tell her that no one from my family had offered to help me move in. My father had simply handed me $200 cash the night before for emergencies and reminded me that my education was my responsibility now. I'd taken the bus into Boston with everything I owned packed into boxes I'd collected from behind the liquor store. College life presented a blank canvas. Nobody knew me as the awkward, unwanted daughter. When Zoe introduced me to people, she called me her super smart roomie who's going to rule the business world someday. Her casual confidence in me was startling and infectious. I approached college with almost military discipline. While other freshmen were discovering the freedom of parent-free living through parties and late nights, I was building a system. Every morning, I woke at 5:30 to use the gym before classes. I took detailed notes in every lecture, asked questions that made professors remember my name, and spent weekends in the library rather than at frat houses. My financial aid covered tuition, but barely. To afford textbooks and living expenses, I took a job at the campus coffee shop and another filing paperwork at an insurance office downtown on weekends. Between work and classes, I slept maybe 5 hours a night. Dark circles became permanent fixtures under my eyes, but I barely noticed them. I was too focused on my goal. During my sophomore year, I met Professor Martinez in my business ethics class. Unlike other professors who lectured from behind podiums, she sat on her desk and challenged us with real-world dilemmas. After one particularly heated class discussion about corporate responsibility, she asked me to stay behind. "You have good instincts," she said, arranging papers on her desk. "But you're holding back." I shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure what you mean." She looked up, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You analyze every angle before speaking. That's valuable, but sometimes in business, you need to trust your gut and take risks." She paused. "I'm mentoring a few students for a business plan competition. You should join us." That invitation changed everything. Under Professor Martinez's guidance, I developed a proposal for a digital platform connecting small local businesses with freelance marketing professionals. The idea was born from watching my coffee shop manager struggle to compete with chains despite having superior products. My pitch won third place and $5,000 in seed money. I used part of the money to invest in my appearance, not out of vanity, but strategy. I researched how successful women presented themselves and made calculated changes. The braces I'd never had as a teenager became my first major expense. I saved for 6 months to afford them, eating ramen and working extra shifts. The orthodontist, Dr. Patel, allowed me to make monthly payments after hearing my story. "Investment in yourself is the best kind," he said during one adjustment. I did the same thing in dental school, lived on nothing to afford a good suit for interviews. Clothes came next. I haunted thrift stores in wealthy Boston neighborhoods, developing an eye for quality pieces that could be altered to look custom-made. A vintage Burberry trench coat found for $30 became my armor. When I wore it, people looked at me differently. Store clerks were more attentive, professors more engaged. By junior year, I had secured an internship at Blackstone Capital, a mid-sized investment firm downtown. The position was unpaid, which meant working my other jobs nights and weekends, but it gave me access to a world I'd only observed from the outside. I watched how deals were made, how relationships were cultivated over lunch meetings and golf outings, and I absorbed every detail. My boss, Kevin Mahoney, was a hard-driving VP who terrified most of the staff. He had a reputation for making interns cry, but something about his directness felt refreshingly honest after years of whispered criticisms from my family. 3 months into my internship, Kevin called me into his office. I was certain I was about to be fired. I'd overheard him complaining about budget cuts. "Sit down," he said, not looking up from his computer. "Your analysis on the Henderson portfolio. You suggested we divest from their retail holdings." I swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. The sector trends showed we did it. Saved the client almost $2 million in potential losses." He finally looked at me. Not bad for an intern. The following week, he converted my internship to a paid position. The salary wasn't much, but it meant I could quit the insurance office job. More importantly, it was validation that my judgment had value. My final year of college passed in a blur of 18-hour days. My business idea from the competition had evolved into a functioning startup with 3 clients. I balanced this with my part-time role at Blackstone and a full-course load. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Graduation day arrived sunny and warm. As I sat among my classmates in my rented cap and gown, I scanned the audience out of habit, not expecting to see any familiar faces. Zoe's parents had invited me to sit with them, a kindness that made my chest tight with emotion. Then I spotted them, my parents and Rachel, sitting stiffly in the middle section. They hadn't told me they were coming. Later, my mother would explain that they had decided, at the last minute, to make the drive up. The congratulations they offered afterward were awkward, tinged with surprise, as if they couldn't quite believe I'd made it through. "So, will you be moving back home while you job hunt?" my father asked over the mediocre lunch they'd agreed to buy me. I smiled politely. "Actually, I've accepted a position at Blackstone. And I'm continuing with my startup. I've already found an apartment in South End." The stunned silence that followed was more satisfying than any praise could have been. That night, alone in my new apartment, small but entirely mine, I stood before the mirror. The reflection showed someone my family wouldn't easily recognize. My teeth were straight now, my clothes tailored and sophisticated. I had learned to style my hair, to apply subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked. But the most profound change was in my eyes. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by quiet confidence. As I hung my hard-earned diploma on the wall, I realized that the labels imposed upon me by my family were merely reflections of their limitations, not mine. I had forged a new identity through relentless work and determination. The transformation wasn't just about appearance or financial status, it was about recognizing my own worth in a world that had tried to convince me I had none. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in flowing calligraphy to my South End apartment. I hadn't spoken to my family in nearly 3 years by then, not since that awkward graduation lunch where they'd struggled to acknowledge my achievements. The cream-colored paper felt heavy in my hands, embossed with a silver monogram. RNJ, Rachel, and James. My sister was getting married. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my new life. The marble countertops I'd splurged on during the renovation, the Viking range I rarely had time to use, the view of Boston's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Success had come faster than even I had anticipated. Blackstone had promoted me twice in 3 years, and my marketing platform had been acquired by a larger tech company for a sum that still seemed unreal when I checked my investment account. I slid a letter opener beneath the envelope's flap and removed the invitation. Rachel was marrying James Preston, heir to a New England shipping fortune. The reception would be held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, one of Boston's most prestigious venues. How fitting for the golden child. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael, my assistant at the office. Thompson account documents ready for your review. Also, Bloomberg wants to confirm the interview for next week. Bloomberg. The financial news outlet was doing a feature on rising stars in Boston's investment scene. My photo would be alongside industry veterans twice my age. The irony wasn't lost on me. I set the invitation on the counter and texted back, on my way in 20. I had a company to run, clients who respected my judgment, colleagues who sought my advice. Why should an invitation from people who had never valued me disrupt my carefully constructed life? Yet as I showered and dressed for work, selecting a charcoal Armani suit and the Louboutins I'd bought to celebrate my last bonus, thoughts of the wedding persisted. Not attending would be the easiest choice. I could send a lavish gift, perhaps something from Rachel's registry at Tiffany's, and continue with my life untouched by old wounds. But something deeper pulled at me, not quite revenge, but a desire for resolution. The family that had once dismissed me would see exactly what I had become. Not out of spite, but as affirmation that their judgment had been profoundly wrong. At the office, I moved through my day with mechanical efficiency. My corner office on the 32nd floor offered views of the harbor, a tangible reminder of how far I'd climbed. My colleagues called me laser-focused, unaware that my mind was partly occupied with thoughts of the upcoming wedding. "You seem distracted," noted Eliza, my closest friend at the firm, as we reviewed quarterly projections. "Not like you to miss a decimal point." I hesitated, then told her about the invitation. "So your estranged family is having this fancy wedding and you're thinking of going?" she clarified, leaning back in her chair. "As what? An exercise in closure or a chance to show off?" "Both, maybe," I admitted. "Is that terrible?" Eliza shrugged. "We all have family baggage. But is reopening old wounds worth it? You've built an amazing life without them." She was right, of course. Yet that evening, I found myself calling the number on the RSVP card. My mother answered, her voice unchanged by time. "Hello?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. 3 years of silence stretched between us. "Mom," I finally said. "It's me." The pause that followed felt endless. "Oh!" We weren't sure if you'd received the invitation." Her voice held surprise, perhaps disappointment that I hadn't simply marked regrets on the response card. "I'll be there," I said simply. "Oh, well, that's nice." Another pause. "Rachel will be pleased." We both knew that was unlikely true. Rachel had probably invited me out of obligation, expecting declination. The conversation that followed was brief and stilted, filled with surface-level updates, but nothing of substance. Neither of us mentioned the years of estrangement or the reasons behind it. After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of the Macallan 18 I kept for special occasions. The liquor burned pleasantly as I wandered to the window, gazing out at the city lights. In the reflection of the glass, I caught a glimpse of myself, confident, successful, unrecognizable from the insecure girl who had left home carrying cardboard boxes and wounded pride. The wedding was 6 weeks away. I approached the preparation with the same strategic planning I applied to business acquisitions. The dress was my first priority, not just any designer gown, but something that would make a statement without seeming like I was trying too hard. I settled on a midnight blue Marchesa with subtle beading that caught the light when I moved. Elegant, but unmistakably expensive. I booked appointments for everything: hair, makeup, even a personal stylist to select the perfect accessories. This wasn't vanity. It was armor. Every detail of my appearance would be calculated to project the success and confidence I had earned. As the date approached, my anxiety manifested in strange ways. I found myself working longer hours, as if proving my worth through professional achievement could somehow prepare me for facing my past. I dreamed of arriving at the wedding only to discover I was still wearing my old thrift store clothes, my teeth crooked again, my success revealed as an elaborate illusion. "You're overthinking this," said Eliza over lunch the week before the wedding. "They're just people. Flawed, judgmental people who happen to share your DNA." "I know," I sighed, pushing my salad around the plate. "But they're the people who shaped how I saw myself for 18 years. And look how you proved them wrong," she pointed out. Bring a hot date, wear something fabulous, make polite conversation, and leave early. Don't give them power over you again. Her advice was sound, but I decided against bringing a date. This confrontation, because that's what it was, despite the celebratory setting, needed to be faced alone. I had rebuilt myself without their support. I would face them on my own terms. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I stood on my balcony at 3 a.m., watching the city below, rehearsing imaginary conversations with family members I hadn't seen in years. What would I say to Aunt Margaret, whose cutting remarks had once reduced me to tears? To my father, whose disappointment had been a constant presence throughout my childhood? To Rachel, the sister who had everything handed to her while I fought for scraps of recognition? As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, casting golden light across the water, I made a decision. I wouldn't seek confrontation. I wouldn't list my accomplishments or flaunt my success. I would simply be present, confident in who I had become. Their approval, or lack thereof, no longer defined me. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect early summer weather. I allowed myself the luxury of professional preparation. A stylist arrived at my apartment to arrange my hair in an elegant updo, followed by a makeup artist who enhanced my features with subtle expertise. As they worked, I sipped champagne and visualized the evening ahead, mentally preparing for every possible scenario. Standing before the mirror in my completed ensemble, the Marchesa gown flowing around me, diamonds at my ears and throat, Jimmy Choo heels adding inches to my height, I hardly recognized myself. Not because of the external trappings of wealth, but because of the calm determination in my eyes. This wasn't about revenge or even validation. It was about reclaiming my narrative and closing a painful chapter of my life. My phone chimed with a notification from the car service I'd arranged. It was time to leave for the Fairmont. Taking one last look at my reflection, I whispered the mantra that had carried me through years of transformation. They didn't define you then. They don't define you now. With that, I gathered my clutch and wrap, stepping out into the warm evening air. The city stretched before me, full of possibility. Whatever happened at the reception, I would return to this life I had built, a life full of meaning, achievement, and genuine connections. A life that was entirely my own creation. The Fairmont Copley Plaza stood illuminated against the darkening Boston sky, its elegant facade a testament to old money and tradition. My driver pulled up to the entrance, where attendants in crisp uniforms ushered guests inside. I took a deep breath, gave my name to the valet, and stepped from the car with practiced grace. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and floral arrangements that must have cost more than my first semester's tuition. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a refined soundtrack to the mingling guests. I recognized faces from my past, distant relatives, family, friends, neighbors from our old neighborhood, all dressed in their finest, champagne flutes in hand. No one recognized me. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and observed the room from its periphery. The confidence I'd cultivated over years in corporate boardrooms served me well here. I stood tall, my posture relaxed but assured, my expression pleasantly neutral. I was both participant and observer, noting the social dynamics at play with the same analytical eye I applied to market trends. A distant cousin, Brian or Brian, I couldn't recall, glanced at me curiously before turning back to his conversation. I'd been invisible to him when we were teenagers. Now I was simply unrecognizable. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Excuse me, do I know you?" The voice came from behind me, tinged with the slight raspiness I remembered from childhood Christmases. I turned to face my Aunt Margaret. She'd aged in the intervening years, her once sharp features softened by time, but her eyes retained their critical assessment. She wore a lavender mother-of-the-bride style dress, her gray-streaked hair arranged in an elaborate updo. "Hello, Aunt Margaret," I said, my voice steady. Her perfectly groomed eyebrows rose slightly. Recognition didn't dawn immediately. She was searching my face for familiar features, trying to place me among the extended family's many branches. "It's me," I said simply. The change in her expression was dramatic, surprise, then disbelief, followed by something that looked almost like embarrassment. "Oh!" My goodness, I didn't. You look so different? I supplied with a small smile. Well, yes, she admitted, flustered in a way I'd never seen before. You certainly have changed. I nodded, taking a deliberate sip of champagne. Life has a way of doing that. Aunt Margaret seemed unsure how to proceed. The script she'd always followed with me, thinly veiled criticism and condescension, no longer applied to the confident woman before her. Are your parents here yet? I don't think they mentioned you were coming. I imagine they're with Rachel. I should find them to say hello. I moved away before she could respond, feeling her eyes follow me through the crowd. One encounter down, many more to go. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked, but outwardly I remained composed. The reception was in full swing now, the ballroom filled with laughter and conversation. I navigated around familiar strangers, nodding politely when our eyes met, a ghost they couldn't quite place. Near the elaborate ice sculpture, a swan, predictably, I spotted my cousin Emma, now with a husband in tow and a slightly rounded belly suggesting early pregnancy. Emma, I greeted her, purposely using the warm tone I reserved for valued clients. She stared at me blankly for a moment, then her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered, then again louder. "Oh my God. Is that really you?" Her husband looked between us, confusion evident. "Em? This is my cousin," she explained to him, gesturing vaguely in my direction, not quite meeting my eyes. "We, grew up together." "James," he introduced himself, extending his hand. I didn't realize Rachel had another cousin coming. "We've lost touch over the years," I explained, shaking his hand firmly. But I couldn't miss my sister's wedding. Emma's mouth opened slightly at this revelation. "Sister? Wait, you're—" "Yes," I confirmed, watching recognition dawn across her features. "Wow," she breathed, taking in my appearance with new understanding. "You look amazing. What have you been up to all these years?" The question seemed genuine, but I offered only the polished, abbreviated version of my life that I reserved for networking events. Emma nodded along, her expression shifting from shock to a complicated mix of admiration and something else, regret, perhaps, or the uncomfortable awareness of past cruelty. "That's really impressive," she said when I finished. "I'm just doing the stay-at-home mom thing now." "Well, soon," she added, touching her stomach. "That's wonderful," I replied sincerely. Whatever our past, I wished her no ill will. "Congratulations." Our conversation faded into awkward silence. James, sensing tension he didn't understand, excused himself to get more drinks. Emma fidgeted with her clutch. "Listen," she began hesitantly. "When we were kids, it was a long time ago," I interrupted gently. This wasn't what I had come for, apologies born from sudden embarrassment rather than genuine remorse. She nodded, relieved to be spared the conversation. "Well, it's really good to see you. You should say hi to Rachel. She's over by the head table." I thanked her and moved on, stopping briefly to greet old neighbors and family acquaintances. Each interaction followed a similar pattern: initial non-recognition, shock upon realization, awkward attempts at reconciling the person before them with the memory of who I had been. I navigated each conversation with practiced ease, neither dwelling on the past nor explaining my transformation. The crowd parted briefly, revealing my parents standing near the gift table. My mother in pale blue silk, my father in a tuxedo that fit him better than the one he'd worn to formal events in my childhood. They were speaking with an older couple I didn't recognize, my mother laughing politely at something being said. For a moment, I was that insecure teenager again, hesitant to approach, anticipating disappointment. The feeling passed quickly. I was no longer seeking their approval. I was here as an equal, perhaps even as someone who had surpassed their limited expectations. I approached with measured steps. My mother saw me first, her practiced social smile freezing on her face as recognition dawned. She reached blindly for my father's arm, gripping it in a way that caused him to turn, following her gaze to where I stood. "Hello," I said simply. "The venue is beautiful." Rachel always did have excellent taste. My father recovered first. Yes, well, the Prestons insisted on the Fairmont. His voice was strained, his eyes darting over my appearance, taking in the designer dress, the subtle jewelry, the confident stance that came from knowing my own worth. You came, my mother said, stating the obvious. We weren't sure if. I RSVP'd, I reminded her gently. Yes, of course, she murmured, flushing slightly. It's just been so long. An uncomfortable silence fell. The couple they'd been speaking with excused themselves tactfully, sensing family tension. You look well, my father offered finally, his tone suggesting surprise. Thank you. You both do too. I kept my voice pleasant, neutral, as if speaking to distant acquaintances rather than the people who had shaped my early understanding of myself. Are you still in Boston? My mother asked, attempting normal conversation. Yes, South End. I have an apartment overlooking the harbor. My father's eyebrows rose slightly. Real estate in that area commanded premium prices, far beyond what they would have expected me to afford. That must be nice. It is, I agreed. I should find Rachel, congratulate her. She's just finished the first round of photos, my mother said. She should be back any minute. As if summoned by her name, the crowd shifted again, and there was my sister, radiant in white, her arm linked with her new husband's. The years had been kind to Rachel. She still possessed the effortless beauty that had always set her apart. James Preston looked precisely as I would have expected, tall, conventionally handsome, emanating the quiet confidence of someone who has never questioned his place in the world. Rachel scanned the crowd, her practiced smile faltering when her gaze landed on our small family grouping. She whispered something to James, and they changed direction, heading toward us. Mom, Dad, she greeted them with kisses on cheeks before turning to me. The smile she offered was uncertain, her eyes widening as she took in my transformation. You came? I wasn't sure. Congratulations, I said warmly, leaning in to kiss her cheek as she had done with our parents. The ceremony was lovely. It was a lie. I had deliberately missed the church service, unwilling to sit through the religious rituals that had never brought me comfort. But the white lie served its purpose, easing the tension slightly. Thank you, she murmured, then remembered her manners. This is James, my husband. She said the last word with a hint of wonder, as if still adjusting to its reality. James shook my hand firmly. Rachel's told me about you, he said, though his tone suggested the stories hadn't been recent or particularly detailed. All good things, I hope, I replied with a small smile. Of course, Rachel said quickly, too quickly. An uncomfortable silence descended again, heavy with unspoken history. The music changed, signaling the beginning of dinner. We should find our seats, my mother said, relief evident in her voice. I glanced at the seating chart earlier and knew I had been placed at a distant table with cousins twice removed and ancient great-aunts, family in name only, strangers in reality. It was exactly what I had expected, and I found I didn't mind. The evening was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated, each interaction confirming what I already knew. I had outgrown the box they had placed me in long ago. As we moved toward our respective tables, Rachel touched my arm lightly, holding me back for a moment. I really am glad you came, she said, her voice lower, meant only for me. It's been too long. I studied her face, searching for the sister I had once known beneath the polished bride exterior. Yes, I agreed simply. It has. Dinner progressed with practiced elegance, 5 courses served by silent waitstaff, wine glasses never allowed to empty, gentle laughter punctuating conversations around white-clothed tables. I sat between Great-Aunt Edith, who was nearly deaf and kept mistaking me for a Preston cousin, and a second cousin who worked in pharmaceutical sales in Providence. The conversation was mercifully shallow, requiring little emotional investment. From my strategic position, I could observe the head table where my parents sat with Rachel, James, and his family. They looked like a tableau from a society magazine, perfect smiles, perfect posture, united in their celebration of perfect union. It was the family portrait I had never been included in, now formalized in seating arrangements. I wasn't bitter. That realization struck me midway through the poached salmon course. The ache I had carried for so long had transformed into something different, not quite indifference, but a removed understanding of what had shaped us all. My family hadn't rejected me out of calculated malice. They simply couldn't see beyond their narrow definitions of value and success. As dessert was served, a delicate lemon soufflé that melted on the tongue, the toasts began. James's father spoke first, his voice carrying authority cultivated in boardrooms and country clubs. He welcomed Rachel to their family with genuine warmth, speaking of tradition and future generations. My father followed, his speech more stilted but earnest, expressing pride in the woman Rachel had become. No mention of her sister. I hadn't expected otherwise. After coffee was served, the band took up their instruments and the dance floor opened. The newlyweds performed their first dance to a classic Sinatra standard, moving with the easy confidence of those who had taken lessons specifically for this moment. James's father claimed Rachel for the second dance, and my father led James's mother onto the floor. Tradition dictated and everyone followed, roles assigned and performed without question. I slipped away during the commotion, finding temporary solace on the terrace overlooking Copley Square. The June evening had cooled pleasantly, the city lights twinkling against the darkened sky. I leaned against the stone balustrade, allowing myself a moment of quiet reflection. "Hiding out here, huh?" The voice was familiar yet unexpected. I turned to find Mark Stevens, my high school chemistry lab partner, approaching with 2 champagne flutes. "Thought you might want a refill." "Mark," I said, genuinely surprised. "You're here." He nodded, handing me a glass. Rachel and I stayed friends through college. BU wasn't far from Northeastern, remember? He studied my face with open curiosity. "You look amazing, by the way." "I almost didn't recognize you." "Thanks." I accepted the compliment easily. Mark had been one of the few people who had been kind to me in high school, not a close friend, but never cruel. "How are you?" "Can't complain." Finished med school at Tufts, doing my residency at Mass General now. Cardiology. He leaned against the balustrade beside me, loosening his tie slightly. "What about you? Last I heard you were studying business." I gave him the unabridged version this time, something about his genuine interest inviting honesty. I told him about Blackstone, about my startup, about the apartment overlooking the harbor. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his expression shifting from curiosity to admiration. "That's incredible," he said when I finished. "I mean, I always knew you were smart. You saved my ass in chemistry more than once, but this is really impressive." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much his validation meant, coming from someone who had no obligations of blood or business to offer it. "Do they know?" he asked, gesturing with his glass toward the ballroom, where my family continued their celebration. "Not really," I admitted. "We haven't exactly kept in touch." Mark nodded, understanding without needing the details. "Their loss," he said simply. We fell into comfortable conversation, reminiscing about shared high school memories, filling in the gaps of our respective journeys. It was the most genuine interaction I'd had all evening, unmarred by the weight of family expectations or past hurts. When he eventually excused himself to speak with other friends, I felt strangely reluctant to end our conversation. "Maybe we could get coffee sometime," he suggested. "Catch up properly." "I'd like that," I replied, surprising myself with my sincerity. Returning to the ballroom, I found the celebration in full swing. The formal dinner portion had ended, and guests now mingled freely, some dancing, others gathered in conversational clusters around the room. The atmosphere had relaxed with the consumption of alcohol and the passage of time. I moved through the crowd, no longer invisible but recognized now, the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations. My transformation had become the evening's secondary entertainment, a narrative rivaling the main event. I felt their eyes follow me, relatives who had once looked through me, family friends who had forgotten my existence, peers who had dismissed me as unworthy of attention. Near the ornate chocolate fountain, I encountered my father again. He was alone for the first time that evening, his bow tie slightly askew, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He seemed startled to find himself face to face with me, as if he'd forgotten I was among the guests. "You're still here," he observed unnecessarily. "Did you expect me to leave early?" He shifted uncomfortably. "No, we haven't really had a chance to talk." "No," I agreed. "We haven't." A bead of silence stretched between us. He cleared his throat. "You mentioned you're living in South End now. What is it that you do, exactly?" The question was casual, conversational, the kind fathers typically asked daughters they hadn't spoken to in years. I studied him for a moment, the slight gray at his temples, the fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at my graduation. He looked older, but also smaller somehow, less imposing than the figure who had loomed so large in my childhood. "I'm Senior Investment Manager at Blackstone Capital," I said evenly. "And I founded Market Match, the digital marketing platform. We were acquired last year by TechSphere." His expression shifted from polite interest to stunned disbelief. "Blackstone? But that's a major firm, yes. And Market Match? That was your company? The one that was in the Globe." I nodded, watching as he struggled to reconcile this information with his perception of me. The Boston Globe had run a business section feature on the acquisition, complete with my photo and a brief profile highlighting my meteoric rise in the financial sector. "That's remarkable," he said finally, his voice strained. "Your mother and I had no idea." "You never asked," I replied simply. He flinched slightly at the truth of it. "We should have kept in touch," he conceded. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." My mother approached then, relief evident in her expression at finding us together. "There you are," she said to my father before acknowledging me with a nod. "Rachel's about to throw the bouquet." "You should go," I told her. "I wouldn't want you to miss it." She hesitated, something like regret flickering across her features. "Will you be staying much longer?" The question held more meaning than its surface suggested. Would I remain at the periphery of their lives, a ghost occasionally glimpsed at family functions? Or would I disappear again, returning to the separate existence I had built? "I have early meetings tomorrow," I said, offering neither commitment nor complete rejection. "Investment markets don't pause for family weddings." My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "Investment markets," he repeated. "Your mother mentioned you were in finance, but I had no idea." "There's a lot you don't know," I said, keeping my tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. A commotion near the dance floor interrupted us, Rachel gathering the single women for the bouquet toss, the photographer positioning himself for the perfect shot. My mother touched my father's arm. "We should go over. Rachel will want us in the photos." My father nodded distractedly, his eyes still on me. "We'll continue this conversation," he said, the statement somewhere between question and promise. "Perhaps," I allowed. As they moved away, I decided it was time. I had seen enough, confirmed what I already knew, that I had outgrown the need for their validation or approval. I had come seeking closure, and in their stunned reactions and awkward conversations, I had found it. There was nothing more to gain by prolonging the evening. I retrieved my wrap from the coat. "Check," and was heading toward the exit when Rachel's voice called from behind me. "You're leaving?" Without saying goodbye, I turned to find her approaching, still radiant in her wedding gown, but with a hint of vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't noticed earlier. The perfect bride facade had slipped slightly, revealing the sister I had once known beneath. "Congratulations again," I said. "It was a beautiful wedding." "Thank you for coming." She hesitated, then added, "Dad just told me about your company. The one that was sold. And Blackstone. Why didn't you tell us?" "When would I have done that, Rachel?" I asked quietly. "At the family gatherings I wasn't invited to? During the holiday calls that never came?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know we haven't been close. But that's incredible, what you've accomplished." "Thank you." "The photographer mentioned he recognized you from the business journal spread," she continued. "He asked if you were really my sister. Apparently you're something of a big deal in financial circles." I shrugged slightly. "I've done well." "Well?" She gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Dad said your company sold for millions. That's more than well." I didn't correct her assumption about the acquisition price, which had actually been in the low 8 figures. It was a fair valuation. Rachel shook her head, a mixture of admiration and something like hurt in her expression. I can't believe you never told any of us. Would it have mattered? I asked. The question wasn't bitter, merely curious. She didn't answer immediately, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. It might have, she finally admitted. To me, at least. I always thought you just disappeared because you couldn't handle family stuff. I never imagined you were building an empire or whatever. Not an empire, I corrected gently. Just a life I'm proud of. She nodded, glancing back toward the reception where her new husband was now searching the crowd for her, his expression concerned. I should get back, she said. James is looking for me. Of course. She hesitated, then stepped forward and embraced me briefly. The gesture was awkward, unfamiliar. When had we last hugged? Before college, certainly. Don't be a stranger, she whispered. I mean it this time. I nodded, not committing but not refusing. As she turned to go, I called after her softly. Rachel. She paused, looking back. I really am happy for you, I said, offering the truth as a parting gift. Her smile was genuine then, tinged with the complicated mix of emotions that defined our relationship. Thank you, she said simply. I watched her return to her husband, to her perfect wedding, to the life that had been shaped by family support and expectation. Then I stepped out into the warm June night, leaving behind the echoes of my past and carrying forward only what served the woman I had become. The morning after Rachel's wedding dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows of my South End apartment. I woke earlier than usual despite having returned late, some inner restlessness preventing deeper sleep. Making coffee in my kitchen, I found myself replaying moments from the previous evening, the shocked recognition in Aunt Margaret's eyes, my father's stunned realization of my professional success, Rachel's unexpected embrace. My phone buzzed with a text from Eliza, wedding survivor check-in. How bad was it? I smiled, tapping out a response. Survived with minimal emotional scarring. We'll debrief over lunch. Setting my phone aside, I carried my coffee to the balcony. Boston Harbor stretched before me, morning sun glinting off the water, sailboats already dotting the horizon. The city was coming alive with Sunday morning activity, joggers along the waterfront, brunch seekers heading to favorite spots, tourists beginning their explorations of the Freedom Trail. The familiar view grounded me, reminding me of everything I had built beyond the shadow of family expectation. The previous night's revelation had been neither as dramatic nor as satisfying as I had sometimes imagined during those early years of struggling to reinvent myself. There had been no grand confrontation, no moment of perfect vindication, just a series of quiet recognitions, uncomfortable conversations, and subtle shifts in perception. My intercom buzzed, pulling me from my reflections. The doorman's voice came through the speaker. Ms. Mitchell, there's a delivery for you. Curious, I wasn't expecting anything. I authorized the delivery. Minutes later, a knock at my door revealed a uniformed courier holding a small package wrapped in silver paper with a cream envelope attached. Thank you, I said, accepting the delivery and tipping the courier. Back in my kitchen, I examined the package. The envelope bore my name in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a card with the wedding's monogram at the top. I know traditionally the bride receives gifts, not gives them, but I wanted you to have this. Thank you for coming yesterday. It meant more than I can express. Rachel, I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a silver frame containing a photograph I didn't immediately recognize. It showed two young girls sitting on a beach, one about 8, the other perhaps 3, building a sandcastle together. With a start, I realized it was Rachel and me at Cape Cod during one of our family summer vacations before things had soured, before I became the outsider. The gesture was unexpected, touching in its simplicity and the memory it evoked. I traced the outline of our childish faces, trying to recall the day, the feeling of sand between my toes, the simple joy of creating something with my big sister. The photograph captured a moment before awareness of difference, before judgment and rejection had created the chasm between us. My phone rang, my mother's name appearing on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Hello? Good morning, she said, her voice tentative. I hope I'm not calling too early. No, I've been up. An awkward pause followed. Your father and I were wondering if you might join us for lunch today. Nothing formal, just at the hotel before we drive back home. The invitation surprised me. I have plans this afternoon, I said, which was true, my lunch with Eliza. Oh! Disappointment colored her voice. Another time, perhaps? I found myself offering an alternative. I could meet for coffee before your drive if you'd like. There's a good cafe near the Commons. We'd like that, she said quickly, relief evident. Just text me the address. Is 10:30 too soon? 10:30 works, I agreed, giving her the name of the cafe. After ending the call, I stood in my kitchen, surprised by my own willingness to extend the connection. The wedding had been about closure, about proving something to them, to myself. I hadn't anticipated this aftermath, this tentative reaching across the divide. At 10:15, I arrived at Thinking Cup, securing a table by the window. I ordered my usual courte-à-deux and waited, watching the door with a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity. They arrived precisely at 10:30, my mother in a casual but elegant outfit that still spoke of careful consideration, my father in what passed for casual in his world, pressed chinos and a button-down shirt without a tie. They spotted me immediately, making their way through the busy cafe. Up close, in the morning light, they looked older than they had in the dimmed elegance of the reception venue. My father's hair was thinner than I remembered, my mother's hands more veined and spotted with age. Thank you for meeting us, my mother said as they sat down. We've ordered. This place is lovely. It's one of my favorites, I replied, the mundane exchange feeling strangely significant, the first normal conversation we'd had in years. We spoke of safe topics at first, the wedding details, the weather, the pleasant drive they anticipated back to the suburbs. Then, as our drinks arrived, my father cleared his throat. I did some research this morning, he said, his tone more serious. About Market Match and your work at Blackstone. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. The Globe article mentioned you were named to their 40 under 40-foot list last year. And the Business Journal profile. He paused, visibly struggling to reconcile this information with his perception of me. You've accomplished remarkable things. Thank you, I said simply. We didn't know, my mother added, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her cup. All these years, we had no idea. I didn't do it for recognition, I said. Especially not from family. My father winced slightly but nodded. I understand that. But still, we should have. He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Should have what? Stayed in touch? Supported me? Been better parents? What happened? My mother asked softly. When did things go so wrong between us? The question was genuine, her confusion real. I realized with sudden clarity that they truly didn't understand the depth of what had occurred, how their constant disapproval and comparison had shaped me, how their casual dismissal of my worth had driven me away and simultaneously fueled my determination to prove them wrong. It wasn't one moment, I explained, choosing my words carefully. It was years of feeling like I wasn't enough. Like nothing I did could measure up to the standards you set. We pushed you because we believed in your potential, my father said, defensive but also uncertain. I shook my head. No, you pushed Rachel because you believed in her potential. You dismissed me because I didn't fit your expectations. They exchanged glances, a silent communication developed over decades of marriage. My mother reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. We never meant to make you feel that way. I believe you, I said, surprising myself with the realization that I did. But intent doesn't change impact. My father nodded slowly, a rare acknowledgement of fault. No, it doesn't. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. I've always approached parenting like business, focusing on results, on measurable success. It was short-sighted. The admission, partial though it was, felt significant coming from a man who had rarely acknowledged error. Rachel showed us your photograph this morning, my mother said, changing direction slightly. The one she gave you. Do you remember that day? Vaguely, I admitted. Cape Cod, right? I must have been 3 or 4. She nodded, a faint smile softening her features. You were so determined to build the biggest sandcastle on the beach. Rachel kept trying to help, but you insisted on doing parts yourself, even when the waves kept washing them away. The memory surfaced slowly, the frustration of collapsing sand, the warmth of the sun, Rachel's patient assistance. I'd forgotten that, I said quietly. You were always stubborn, my father said, but the words held something like admiration now. Independent. We should have recognized that strength instead of trying to reshape it. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of unintended hurt on both sides. But beneath the awkwardness was something I hadn't expected, a genuine desire to understand, to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. They asked questions about my life, my work, my apartment, not out of obligation but interest. I found myself sharing selected details, careful not to reveal too much too quickly, but open to the possibility of reconnection. As our meeting drew to a close, my mother hesitated, then asked, "Might we see you again? Perhaps dinner sometime, when things are less rushed." I considered the invitation. The easy answer would be no, to protect the life I had built, the self I had become without their influence. But there was another possibility now, one I hadn't anticipated when I'd accepted Rachel's wedding invitation, the chance to establish a new relationship, not as the disappointed child and critical parents, but as adults who shared history and might yet find common ground. I travel a lot for work, I said, neither accepting nor refusing. But I could check my calendar. Relief washed over her face. That would be wonderful. They stood to leave, my father settling the bill despite my protest. At the door, he paused. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he said, the words coming with difficulty but sincerity. "You did it entirely on your own, which makes it all the more impressive." The acknowledgement, so long desired and now finally offered, felt different than I had imagined. Not like vindication, but like the closing of a circle, the healing of an old wound that would always leave a scar but no longer caused pain. "Thank you," I said simply. We parted with awkward half-hugs and promises to be in touch that might or might not be kept. I watched them walk toward their car, these familiar strangers who had shaped so much of who I had become, both through their presence and their absence. Later that afternoon, over lunch with Eliza, I recounted the meeting. "So you're telling me your grand revenge plot turned into a family reconciliation?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. "Not reconciliation exactly," I clarified. "More like acknowledgement. Recognition that we all contributed to what happened and might choose something different going forward. And you're okay with that? After everything they put you through?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm okay with the possibility of it," I said finally. "Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but maybe building something new that honors who I am now." "Very evolved of you," she remarked, signaling for the check. "But if they start criticizing your life choices again, all bets are off, right?" I smiled, grateful for her protective instinct. "Absolutely. This is a trial basis only." That evening, I found myself drawn to my home office, to the cabinet where I kept important documents. In the back of the bottom drawer was a small wooden box I hadn't opened in years. It contained the few mementos I had taken when I left home, a high school academic award, a photograph of our old house, the acceptance letter from Northeastern, and a small silver charm bracelet my grandmother had given me on my 10th birthday. I added Rachel's framed photograph to the collection, a bridge between past and present. Then, making a decision, I placed the box on my bookshelf rather than returning it to its hidden drawer. These artifacts of my journey, painful though some memories might be, deserved to be acknowledged rather than buried. Standing at my window as twilight fell over Boston Harbor, I reflected on the transformation of the past 24 hours. I had gone to Rachel's wedding seeking closure, a final confirmation that I had risen above my family's limited perception of my worth. I had expected to walk away with vindication, but nothing more. Instead, I found myself facing the possibility of something I hadn't anticipated, not the erasing of past wounds, but the potential for new connections that respected the person I had become. The journey from rejection to self-realization had never been about proving my worth to others, but about recognizing it within myself. Having achieved that, I could now choose whether to include them in my life from a position of strength rather than need. 9 years had passed since I'd left home with nothing but determination and wounded pride. In that time, I had transformed not just my circumstances, but my understanding of myself. The weight of disgrace I had carried for so long had been replaced by the quiet confidence of self-knowledge. Whatever came next, whether tentative family reconnection or continued independence, would be my choice, shaped by the woman I had become rather than the girl they had failed to see.